Job chapter 14. This is the third chapter in a three-chapter speech in which Job is condemning all three of his friends at once and sort of summarizing all their speeches against him. Today we come to the end of that lengthy speech which started in chapters 12 and was in 13 last week and now here in 14. Job chapter 14, page 523 in your Geneva Bible. Job chapter 14, beginning at verse 1. Man that is born of woman is of short continuance and full of trouble. He shooteth forth as a flower, and is cut down. He vanisheth also as a shadow, and continueth not. And yet thou openest thine eyes upon such one, and causest me to enter into judgment with thee. Who can bring a clean thing out of filthiness? There is not one. Are not his days determined? The number of his months are with thee. Thou hast appointed his bound, which he cannot pass. Turn from him, that he may cease until his desired day, as an hireling. For there is hope of a tree, if it be cut down, that it will yet sprout, and the branches thereof will not cease. Though the root of it wax old in the earth, and the stock thereof be dead in the ground. Yet by the scent of water it will bud, and bring forth boughs like a plant. But man is sick and dieth, and man perisheth, and where is he? As the waters pass from the sea, and as the flood decayeth and drieth up, so man sleepeth and riseth not, for he shall not wake again, nor be raised from his sleep till the heaven be no more. Oh, that thou wouldest hide me in the grave, and keep me secret until thy wrath were past, and wouldest give me term and remember me. If a man die, shall he live again? All the days of mine appointed time will I wait, till my changing shall come. Thou shalt call me, and I will answer thee. Thou lovest the work of thine own hands. But now thou numberest my steps, and dost not delay my sins. Mine iniquity is sealed up as in a bag, and thou addest unto my wickedness. And surely as the mountain that falleth cometh to naught, and the rock that is removed from his place, as the water breaketh the stones, when thou overflowest the thing which grow in the dust of the earth, so thou destroyest the hope of man. Thou prevailest always against him, so that he passeth away. He changeth his face when thou casteth him away. And he knoweth not if his sons shall be honorable, neither shall he understand concerning them whether they shall be of low degree. But while his flesh is upon him, he shall be sorrowful, and while his soul is in him, it shall mourn. The title of our message this morning, Job chapter 14, verses 1 to 22. Job answers all three friends, part 3 of 3. We come to our introduction. In this chapter, we come to an end of Job's speech to his friends and his dispute with God. This speech marks the end of the first cycle and the beginning of the second. From Job chapter 12, verse 1 through chapter 13, verse 19, Job criticized his friends. But beginning with Job chapter 13, verse 20 through chapter 14, verse 22, Job has a one-sided dispute with God. Job began this speech by rebuking his friends and warning them to pay close attention, for Job will now speak directly to God. Job warns them that their false view of retribution may be in danger of God's correction. Job begins his address to God by asking him directly to name and catalog his sins. That's what we saw in the first 6 verses of last week's text. Now we hear the rest of his dispute with God. Paul, will you take this back to Dustin? Thank you. There are 3 points to our message this morning. Verses 1 to 6, the brevity and failure of human life. Our second point, verses 7 through 17, Job anticipates his own death. And then in verses 18 through 22, Job complains of the hopelessness of life. We come to our context this morning. Job's attack against God is due to a misconception on Job's part. He has unfortunately listened to his friends who have convinced him that his calamity was the result of his sin. We know that's wrong. Job wrongly reasons that since his calamity is so severe, therefore his sin must also be so severe. Job searches his youth and his adulthood and finds nothing worthy of the punishment he received. He therefore concludes that God is too severe a judge and that man cannot possibly please God. And of course, that's all wrong. God must have had an agenda against man, reasons Job, that allows for the severest of punishments for the minutest of sins. Job fails to realize that God is not punishing him. Yet, he has allowed Job to be tried. If Job only knew the trial would very soon come to an end and that he would be completely restored, he wouldn't be thinking these thoughts. We come to our first point, verses 1 to 6, the brevity, that means briefness, and failure of human life. That's Job's point of view. Verses 1 and 2, man that is born of woman is of short continuance and full of trouble. He shooteth forth as a flower and is cut down. He vanisheth also as a shadow and continueth not. Job here begins his speech by lamenting the shortness and the cruelty of life. Job no longer speaks of himself personally, but now speaks of mankind in general. Job describes his frailty, which he says began at birth. He describes himself as a man born of woman. All men, we know, born of woman, except Christ, were born into a weakened state, having inherited the sins of their father. Job implies that since man is already born into such a frail state, God should not be so heavy-handed in punishing his sin. He goes on to say that the days of man are few and evil. The text says, short continuance and full of trouble. Since life is a series of trouble from the womb, God, thinks Job, should treat man with more compassion. The term trouble here is used in its broadest sense, referring to repeated turmoil that we face in this life. Suffering and shame continually, full of trouble. Man, says Job, is not equipped to handle such inherent trouble with such inherent weakness. Job gives two examples here from nature to show the shortness of life. He mentions a flower and a shadow. A flower blooms in the spring and its life is short-lived, either succumbing to the heat of summer or more likely, according to the text, being cut down by the reaper's sickle along with the grain. The shadow is also quick to disappear, and it is fleeting. At night it drowns in the shadow of the night, says Matthew Henry. Human life for Job is short, sorrowful, sinful, and unfulfilling. It's over before it even seems to begin, and it is worthy of pity by the Creator of life, says Job. Of course, he's making an argument that God would treat it more kindly. So he says, what a wicked and terrible and cruel life this is. Isn't there some kindness in you for those of us who have to go through it? Verse 3, Job says, and yet thou openest thine eyes upon such one, and causest me to enter into judgment with thee. He says that God looks upon man in this weakened state. That's what this phrase, openest thine eyes upon such. And rather than show mercy, finds the smallest fault. Job implies that this lack of mercy and extreme scrutiny is below the station of God. It is as if Job said, Lord, I live but such a short time, and soon I will die. And all my days are full of trouble. Could you not spare me and show me your power and mercy, rather than showing me your power and perpetual judgment? Job believed himself to be blameless, but in his confused state he speaks poorly. And he wrongly concludes that his misery is God's punishment of his sins, which have brought him to enter into judgment or dispute with thee, or God. Verse 4, Job says, who can bring a clean thing out of the filthiness? There is not one. Job says aloud, man is born in sin. The moment that Job was born of woman, the disease of sin ran through his blood. All men born of women inherited the filthiness of their father. And since no baby can be born without the stain of original sin, Job concludes that no clean thing can come out of filthiness. The baby being the clean thing, the filthiness being the inherent sin of the father. Meaning we're all born to sin, in sin. Since all men, for the text says there is not one, are born wicked, and Job only responds to his sin nature that he was born with, how can God punish his sins in such an extraordinary and severe fashion? Where is the divine pity? For the many born in sin who lives a life of trouble. Verse 5, Job goes on, are not his, that is the days of man, determined? The number of his months are with thee. Thou hast appointed his bound, which he cannot pass. Job says, since life comes to such an abrupt halt, and our days are short enough to be numbered, does not man suffer enough knowing that his life will end so soon and be so short and full of trouble? Man is born in sin, and because he's born in sin, he must die, for the wages of sin is death. Is this not punishment enough? Asks Job. Further, the shortness of his life has been determined by the counsel and decree of God. The number of man's days is with God, at the disposal and the power of God. We can do nothing to add to our number of days. God cannot be tricked or deceived from his appointed time of our death. Nothing comes to pass by chance. Our lifespan is unalterable, and his foresight as to when to end our life infallible. It is not as though man can cheat God of even one day. And you can see where Job is building his argument, to say that man should be a creature worthy of pity, not continual wrath. Verse 6, so Job concludes, turn from him, that he may cease until his desired day as an hireling. Man, says Job, as he is short-lived, so he is sad-lived. Though he has but a few days to spend here, if he could rejoice in a few days, life might not seem so harsh. But every day, says Job, is full of trouble, toiling or fretting, grieving or fearing. No day passes without some frustration, some hurry, or some disorder. The fewness of his days creates in him a continual uneasiness, in expectation of some good before his life should come to an end. Since this is the case, Job asks God to desist from making his days so miserable. He desires some relief in his short days. Even the hireling or the day laborer has a rest from his labors. Even the laborer that must work from sunup to sundown and suffer under the hot sun and the extreme cold rests at some point. But Job has no rest day or night. Job says, in life a person should die once, but life has become such a misery that as if he dies every day. He dies 1,000 deaths. We come to our second point, verses 7 through 17. Job anticipates his own death. Verses 7 through 9. These three verses all connected to one another, taken together. For there is a hope of a tree, if it be cut down, that it will yet sprout, and the branches thereof will not cease. Though the root of it wax old in the earth, and the stock thereof be dead in the ground. Yet by the scent of water it will bud, and bring forth boughs and branches, like a plant. We have seen what Job has to say concerning life and the misery of it in the first 6 verses. We now see what he has to say concerning death. This is the first of 2 3-line strophes. 7 through 9 is one strophe, and 10 through 12 is another. The first strophe, verses 7 through 9, speaks of the hope of the tree. And this will be contrasted with a hope of humankind for life beyond death in verses 10 to 12, which leads to verses 13 through 17, in which Job wishes that Sheol, rather than being a place of no return, could be a place of safe hiding from the divine wrath. So here in this first strophe, verses 7 through 9, the picture is of a tree that has been cut down, which immediately begins to decay and wither by natural processes. Yet, if it gets even a whiff of water, it may revive. With just a little encouragement, the revived tree will put forth new shoots as if it were just planted. It will seemingly return from the dead. Job wants to know why God should grant his providence of coming back to life to a tree, but not to human creatures. If only Job could have a whiff of encouragement like the tree receives water, his life would not seem so hopeless. The tree has hope. Man, says Job, has no hope. But man is not as easily restored as the tree. Man, of course, needs the immediate operations of God himself to feel hope. Verses 10 to 12, our second strophe here. But man is sick and dieth, and man perisheth, and where is he? As the waters pass from the sea, and as the flood decayeth and drieth up, so man sleepeth and riseth not, for he shall not wake again, nor be raised from his sleep till the heavens be no more. While a tree may grow sick and nearly die, it can be revived by water. But man grows sick and dieth and perisheth, never to be revived like the tree. The person who dies has no hope of being revived. Job does not deny an afterlife for the soul. He refers to the loss of power that is, of course, in the body after death. Next, Job draws a comparison between water that evaporates, he calls it the flood decayeth and drieth up, or drains away, which is the waters that pass from the sea out into the ocean. And he compares that to the human who sinks down into the dust of death. There's a very interesting analogy here. The waters of a lake or sea can vanish in the heat of summer, or dry up, never to be seen again, of course, by evaporation. Just as the sea is present, then forever gone, so also man is alive, then like the water that's in the sea, disappears. Every night we lie down to sleep, and in the morning, the text says, we awake and rise again. Job says, at death we must lie down in the grave, never to awake or rise again. And that's what he says when he says, so man sleepeth and riseth not. The body, like some of those waters, sinks and soaks into the earth and is buried there, as our bodies will rest in the ground. The soul we might compare to the evaporated water. It is drawn upwards. As the water mingles with the waters above the firmament, so the soul goes to heaven. And the rest of the body will continue for a long time, until the heaven be no more, which means when Christ returns and creates a new heaven and a new earth. Verses 13 and 14. Oh, that thou wouldest hide me in the grave and keep me secret, until thy wrath were past, and wouldest give me term and remember me. If a man die, shall he live again? All the days of mine appointed time will I wait till my changing shall come. Now Job here drops one fiction for another. He earlier claimed that he was speaking in the name of all humanity, when he was really speaking mostly of himself. Now he does speak only for himself. Job says he wishes that he could hide in the grave. This is not to imply that Job believes that body and soul cease to exist in the grave. Job imagines a fiction here. He imagines the grave as a place that he could hide until God's anger surpasses. Then he could reemerge from the grave in the good graces of God. If Job could reemerge from the grave, his wish is that God would remember him in the same favorable light that he enjoyed before God began his overzealous scrutiny of Job, in which Job fell into some supposed disfavor course, Job's newest fiction is an impossible dream. Man cannot escape the wrath of God in the grave, nor does Job even believe it. Nevertheless, Job allows himself to think of an impossible scenario where God would allow Job to escape to the grave until such a time that God's forgotten his anger towards Job. Job says that he's willing to wait in the grave however long it takes. He says, I will wait till my changing shall come, meaning the changing in his estate before God. Verse 15, thou shalt call me, and I will answer thee. Thou lovest the work of thine own hands. Job here, of course, longs for the day that such an event could happen, that he would be safely hidden away in the grave from the wrath of God, and then suddenly God would call him forth and he would no longer be angry with Job. In reality, Job often tried to call upon God, but as we know, for a long time God remained silent, removed his presence. It's easy to see why Job believes God must contact him. His calling upon God has amounted to nothing. Therefore, Job he must assume that since God broke the relationship, it must be up to God to mend it. Therefore, Job says, I wish I could patiently wait in the grave until the time should come that thou shalt call me. He says, I would readily answer and come forward, eager to resume the relationship with God that was once personable, and understandable. Verse 16 and 17. But Job goes on and says, but now thou numberest my steps, and dost not delay my sins. Mine iniquity is sealed up as in a bag, and thou addest unto my wickedness. Job's dream of safety in the grave from the supposed wrath of God now returns to reality, where Job still suffers and doesn't know why. And God appears to be an over-officious judge, marking and punishing every one of Job's missteps. When Job complains that God numbereth my steps, he means that God performs the closest possible scrutiny of Job's behavior. Job wishes he could get rid of such scrutiny. Furthermore, when Job sins, he feels as if he is immediately punished. That's what the text means when it says, and dost not delay my sins. The punishment comes immediately. No sin gets overlooked. Job then compares himself to that of a prisoner. In verse 17, he accuses God of keeping a meticulous record of all of Job's faults. The image of sealing up mine iniquity refers to a judge who writes down all the offenses of a prisoner and keeps them in a bag in case the person should once again show up in his court, or in Job's case, sin, at which time he would relist all the prisoner's former offenses. God to Job is a judge who just keeps adding up Job's sins, those in his adult years and those from his childhood. And so Job says, thou addest unto my wickedness, or keeps an account of all my sins. And finally here in verses 18 to 22, Job comes to the end of his 3-chapter speech. Job complains of the hopelessness of life. Verses 18 and 19, Job says, and surely as the mountain that falleth cometh to naught, or nothing, and the rock that is removed from his place, as the water breaketh the stones, when thou overflowest the things which grow in the dust of the earth, so thou destroyest the hope of men. Job returns from his dream world to a stark reality where there is no hope for humans. Job had tantalized himself with the thought of what could be hoped for if humans could renew themselves like a tree, or temporarily hide in the grave from God. He knows those were pipe dreams. Here we have 4 pictures from the natural world. We have the mountain that falls and comes to nothing. We have the rock, the big rock, the boulder that is removed from its place. We have the water that breaks the boulder into smaller stones. And we have the raging water that takes away the good soil, overflows the things which grow in the dust of the earth, and destroys all vegetation. Each of these natural developments serves the same function, to illustrate that once something is past and gone, it can never return. The peak of a mountain is high and glorious, but it will fall, and that mountain will never again be that same height. The immovable rock will eventually be dislodged by water that forms cracks, which makes the rock to fall. And the big rock will fall from its heights and never return to its former place. Big boulders will eventually become little stones. They will not remain great boulders. Water will flow over the vegetation, washing away the soil so that the land that was once rich in plant life will become barren. The good soil will never return. These four images display the inevitable destruction of all things. Job compares man to these four natural phenomena. Man lives a very short time. His life is like the mountain, the rock, and the good soil for a very short time. As nature must inevitably fail, so must man. Since man has no hope of continuing forever in life and must die, and since the idea of man living forever is as hopeless as nature not ever wearing away, Job wonders aloud if God could be more merciful and allow him some hope of a happy future. Verses 20 and 21. Thou prevailest always against him, so that he passeth away. He changes his face when thou castest him away. And he knoweth not if his son shall be honorable. Neither shall he understand concerning them whether they shall be of a low degree. Death here is depicted now as God's victory over human hope or life. Death cannot be stalled or cheated. It is direct divine activity that causes a person death. It is the destructive force of God. Death is simply the end of God's dealing with all men on earth. In the end, God's desires for our death inevitably prevail. It is God who disfigures the appearance of a person with the ravages of time. That's what the text means when it says he changes his face. Then God banishes humans from their land. That's what it means when it says thou castest him away. Once a person dies, Job goes on, they have no knowledge of what becomes of their children. It says, and he knoweth not if his son shall be honorable. Meaning he does not know whether his children have made a success of their life, spiritually and materially. Or neither shall he understand concerning them whether they shall be of low degree. The dead do not know if the lives of their children have gone poorly. He does not know whether he has few descendants or many. The dead know nothing about the living, says Job. And finally he concludes in verse 22, but while his flesh is upon him, he shall be sorrowful, and while his soul is in him, it shall mourn. Job concludes his speech on a note of extreme sadness. His hope to interact with God in a dispute has now lost all its energy. And he says life on earth is sorrowful, it's a misery as long as man is confined to flesh and his living body still houses his soul. He will mourn. Seeing that this is the case, Job asks for some relief or comfort to sweeten his bitter, hopeless life. Now let's look at the application of these verses.